much. I want to start just by introducing our guest speakers today who have so kindly joined us on this early morning to talk about their work in Colombia and Brazil and just their background. They come to us from Data Pop Alliance, which is a collaborative lab and in partnership with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, the MIT Connection Science, the Flowminder Foundation, and as well as the Overseas Development Institute. So the organization is doing some amazing work in this area of data science and human rights and looking at various cases globally to try to understand some of how practitioners as well as policymakers and scientists can work better to safeguard the rights of citizens around the globe. And so the projects are really fascinating. And today they'll be talking to us about Colombia and Brazil. And just a bit of background, Anna Spinardi joins us. She's a gender program and research manager at Data Pop Alliance. She holds an MSc in Global Development from the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. She also has a BA in International Relations from the University of the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's focused on gender inequality, gender-based violence, and she's worked on conditional cash transfers and women's empowerment in Colombia and systemic corruption and white-collar crimes in Brazil. She's also worked as a gender advisor at the Permanent Mission of Brazil to the United Nations in New York and has provided guidance and support to the Brazilian delegation on the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Peace. So we're really happy to have her, and joining her is Mateo Rojas, who is a project and research manager at Data Pop Alliance. He holds a BA in political science from Bogota, Colombia, and also is doing an MSc in applied economics. Prior to this, he was a research assistant tracing bills on laws that were passed through the Colombian Congress, and later as a research assistant at Duke University, looking at agenda setting in the United States Supreme Court. And he is also he was a part of the political section of the Canadian Embassy in Bogota. So I was happy to hear about that. And he was responsible for writing reports on issues around security, politics, and cultural diplomacy, as well as human rights violations in Colombia. So we're really excited to have you both with us today. And the students have had access to the report as well as the executive summary. And I have no doubt that we'll have some questions for you, and really excited about engaging with you all in this important work that you've done. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and welcome.
Thank you, Professor, for that very detailed and a cool introduction. So I think we could just, Anna, maybe just skip to the agenda. We're very excited to be here. Thank you. We're looking forward to all your questions and comments with regards to this project. So I'm Mateo, just as Professor Karen has introduced us. I'm a project manager here at DPA, and I'm based in Bogota. So what we'll do today is actually, this is like the agenda, right? So the first part of the presentation will be focused on the project that, meaning the methodology, the literature review we did, the results we came to, and then also the obstacles and ethical dilemmas we faced during the project development. Then we'll maybe have a short break because it's going to be a lot of information, and I know that 2 hours of class is very hard sometimes. But then the second part of the presentation is going to focus on as actually discussing how do we hope to build a better and more robust gender data ecosystem that helps not only close the gender data gap, but maybe mitigate violence against women, right? So at the end, we'll have some space to for a Q&A, and yeah, to receive any of your feedback and comments you want to add to the presentation. So again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'll let Anna begin the project presentation then.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mateo. Thank you so much, Professor Karen. So we're going to start with the presentation of the project itself, as Mateo already explained. Thank you so much also for the introduction, Professor. I'm going to jump that part. But just for a little bit of context, as Professor already explained, I'm a gender program and research manager in Data Pop Alliance. I have been leading and conducting most of the gender projects within the organization. And this was actually my first project leading and managing a gender project in DPA. So it's also quite an important project for the organization since actually it was the start of the gender program within Data Pop Alliance. So regarding the problem and the context, so to explain why exactly we focused on investigating research, violence against women and girls, and specifically in the context of like 2 countries in Latin America. So this is also important to highlight precisely because the violence against women and gender-based violence overall was already an endemic issue in Latin America before the pandemic. So here we have some data, precisely some statistics precisely to illustrate how the issue was before the pandemic. So around 35% of women between 15 and 46 years old had already been physically or sexually abused by their partner in the region. And this is also a very important information in terms of what that actually means and what actually that represents. This is only what we call the tip of the iceberg, because one of the biggest obstacles working with violence against women and precisely with data reporting violence against women and girls and gender-based violence is because of the underreporting. So underreporting could be probably featured as the biggest obstacle, because some statistics and some studies that point that only 12% of the women in Latin America that actually suffered some sort of violence by a partner or by someone they don't know, but of violence of gender-based violence, only 12% of them report. So this portrays precisely how the situation of women and girls and other gender minorities in Latin America are quite vulnerable, and how the problem actually is very difficult to assess, because we don't have, and it's very difficult to, and I believe it's quite difficult to estimate the real prevalence of violence against women in the region. And now explaining why specifically we focused in Colombia and Brazil, 2 cities, São Paulo and Bogota. So this is also comes not only from the importance and, let's say, political and economic importance that both countries have on the region, and from a geographic perspective, but also because these 2 countries are some of the 2 of the countries in the region that have the highest number of and the highest rates of violence against women and gender-based violence in the region. So just to give a little bit of context of the data we analyzed before actually starting this project that came during the pandemic, right? So the statistics show that specifically in the case of Colombia, there was a 53.8% increase in calls to the national helpline called 123 line, reporting intimate partner violence in comparison to the same period in 2019. So that actually means that was between March and November of 2020. So almost the entire year of 2020. And in the case of Brazil, it was a bit more difficult to access data regarding telephone registers. So the way that we assessed the situation before actually starting the project was based on tweets. So the Twitter data pointed for us that only in April 2020, so a little bit after the onset of the pandemic in Brazil, which actually started in March 2020, there was a 431% growth in reports, so tweets reporting partner violence with signs of domestic violence. So given this context and given these already starting statistics related to violence against women, we came up with a research question for this project in order to understand how domestic violence how is the situation of domestic violence in Brazil and Colombia. So we came up with a research question: how can we take advantage of existing data, and specifically administrative and non-traditional data, which we're going to be explaining later during the presentation, to better understand domestic violence and generate, of course, public policies to help fight this issue in different contexts. So regarding São Paulo, so São Paulo is actually the biggest city in Brazil, not only the largest city, but also the main economic center of South America, and it's responsible for 10.7% of Brazil's GDP. And despite of the high concentration, so this high concentration of wealth and being the main economic center of the country, São Paulo lacks efficient strategies to systematically collect and also disseminate data on violence against women. This was like an information we had already even before starting the project, and made even more clear after we started developing the project. So this is quite important because the first actually documented case of COVID-19 was in São Paulo, and the city soon became the epicenter of the pandemic in the country, and at some point also in Latin America. And in March 2020, we already knew that the number of calls answered by the military police, so the helpline, local helpline of the military police in the city, reported already an increase of like approximately 45% of reports of domestic violence as in comparison to the same period in 2019. So given this information, our interest in understanding precisely and investigating the cases of domestic violence, and specifically the impact of the COVID-19 on the capability of reporting and registering domestic violence in São Paulo, was because of these features that the city has provided for us. And in the case of the Bogotá, is very similar as the case of São Paulo. So the Bogotá is also the largest city in Colombia, and also the main economic center of the country. But the case of Bogotá is a bit different of São Paulo, because actually Bogotá has started a model for data collecting, availability, and visualization that it's called Datos Abiertos Bogotá. So they have created this platform to actually make violence against women and girls data available and of easy access to the population. So a little bit of as in comparison to São Paulo, Bogotá actually has a way better structure and system to produce data on violence against women. And this is actually something that has started since 2014, so it's actually prior to the pandemic. Comparing also COVID-19 related information between São Paulo and Bogotá, in the case of Bogotá, the government implemented very strict lockdown, which lasted nearly 6 months. This is different from São Paulo, because in São Paulo, we never had actually a strict lockdown. We had, of course, some measures that were implemented by the government to contain the spread of the virus, such as the closure of non-essential services. But different from Bogotá, we actually had a very strict lockdown. And during the first 2 months of the pandemic, that was March and April 2020, the calls to Bogotá local helpline to report domestic violence increased 230%. Also, according to the data from the Attorney General's office, during the year of 2020, Colombian women represented 75.4% of the nearly 110,000 cases of domestic violence in the city. So this is also to illustrate again why we focus specifically on these two cities. They have very important and also very interesting features that made us to focus specifically the research and the development of the model there. So now I'm going to actually explain about the model, about the project. So why we created a data-driven approach to measure reporting and registering of violence against women and girls in these two cities. All right. So of course that to understand the phenomenon of domestic violence and violence against women and girls, we also need to understand what are the factors that actually affect their capacity of reporting when they suffer some sort of violence. So this was pretty much the main question that guided us throughout the entire process. So what are the factors that impact their registering and reporting capacity, and including those that emerged during the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a main goal and one of the main outcomes of this project was precisely to generate results that could contribute to filling the information and the data gaps in Latin America, and of course, contribute in creating a better environment for women. And based on this, we come precisely to our theoretical framework. So the literature presents a vast terminology to define what actually constitutes violence. Therefore, it is essential to establish a common understanding of its connotation to properly actually identify and measure the phenomenon. So commonly used terms included on the literature are such as domestic or family violence, violence against women, intimate partner violence, and gender-based violence. The use of these different terms, they entails a series of implications regarding the space where the violence is committed, so such as the domestic setting, who actually perpetrates the violence, such as an intimate partner, and against whom the violence is perpetrated, because it's not only women, but could be like children as well. So considering the context of the pandemic and our interest in understanding specifically the dynamics behind violence perpetrated against women and girls in the domestic space, we use it and adapted the diagram of Venn to specifically focus on this concept of violence against women and girls in the domestic setting. And another important feature regarding our theoretical framework is precisely our focus on the capabilities approach from Amartya Sen. So I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this theory and this conceptual framework. I guess you are. But central to this approach is precisely the insight that social and economic structures and mechanisms should primarily aim to expand human capabilities rather than national economies. And the concept of capabilities refers to a person's real freedoms or opportunities to be what they would like to be and to do what they would like to do, which Sen later named functioning. So in the context of this project specifically, we understand that functioning, precisely the possibility of a woman to be informed about, for instance, the different channels and the different services that exist in that specific context, so they can report violence when they become victims of violence. In terms of doings, is precisely their capacity or the different resources they have in place to report a case of violence, or only just look for help when they become victims of violence. In this project, that's how we understood and framed the functionings of a woman in the context of violence. And of course, in terms of the environment that could enable them to report a case of violence, are the social and economic policies that are focused on assisting, protecting, and preventing these victims to become actually victims. So again, just to conclude this part of the theoretical framework, in this project, the term capabilities that makes reference to the institutional and societal opportunities offered, which facilitate or hinder the possibility of a woman to report and register a case of violence if they suffer. And now, sorry, you jumped quite a lot. So now I'm going to explain a little bit about the methodology and how were our different research steps to precisely build this model. So it was based on iterative and mixed methods methodology. So at one hand, we collected statistics and quantitative data, specifically from 6 administrative databases at the locality level of Bogota, 4 administrative databases at the neighborhood level in São Paulo. And we also collected, in terms of non-traditional data and you probably are familiar with what we call big data, the Google mobility reports, and also Facebook data for good. The combination of all these different types of data sets, so traditional, administrative, and non-traditional data, allowed us to assess in depth not only the prevalence reported of domestic violence, but also the different factors affecting women's capacity to report violence. This is something we're also going to be explaining a little bit later on the presentation. On the side of like the qualitative methods, we revised in order to build our diagram of risk factors affecting women's or increasing women's vulnerability to suffer violence. We revised it with 147 different articles with this regional focus in Latin America that were articles written in English, Portuguese, Spanish, and that could allow us to specifically portray what are the most important risk factors affecting or increasing women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence. But we also conducted 12 semi-structured interviews with actors from different sectors, specifically the academia, public sector, and also civil society organizations, not only to assess which risk factors were more relevant to each context, so the different cities, São Paulo and Bogotá, but also precisely to validate these information that we collected and put together from the review of the literature. And one very different feature of this project that we also going to explain at some point later, it's precisely the Advisory Council for Development Guidance and Ethics, which we call CODE. So the CODE was an advisory board that we created specifically for this project that were composed by experts from different areas, not only in terms of sectors, so experts from CSOs, academia, government, but also from different areas. So experts on gender, experts on gender-based violence, experts on data privacy, and also experts on ethics in research. So the idea of having this advisory board was precisely to guarantee that not only the collection of data, the use of data, and the interpretation of the results we were making were ethically guided and respecting ethical principles on research, but also to help us contextualize the findings for each of the cities. So regarding specifically the statistical model that we created of the capabilities of registering and reporting, this model was built in two different stages. So during the first stage, was the stage in which we focused mapping the prevalence of violence against women and girls in each of the cities. So it was the stage in which we not only collected these administrative databases, but also the stage in which we approximately or we estimated more or less the number of cases that were reported in each of the contexts. During the stage two was the stage in which we measured the impact of the risk factors. So it was the stage precisely that we used the non-traditional databases that I just mentioned, that are the Google mobility reports, Facebook Data for Good, but not only these two data sources, we also used other different national surveys of each of the cities that provided information on risk factors affecting or increasing women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence. And during this stage was precisely the stage that we measured the probability that a woman reports a case of violence, given certain characteristics, which are precisely the factors, the risk factors. And of course, the final stage and the main outcome of this process was precisely the data visualization tool that we created, in which it's possible to identify by different localities and places of the city, the capacity of reporting and registering domestic violence. So here it's also quite important to understand when we talk about statistics and administrative data on violence against women, we say that we are only looking at the tip of the iceberg. So this diagram precisely shows to you what are the different layers of the data that we should have in terms of violence against women. So the data that we actually had access to is precisely what we call the tip of the iceberg, because it's the official or like administrative data. That is the data about women who suffered violence and reported, but the data that we had access to. Because the next layer is precisely the data that portrays the total data, the total number of registries of domestic violence, but we do not have access to the total number of data. We only had access to those data that government bodies and CSOs agreed in sharing with us. Then after this, the third layer would be what we call the estimated violence. So this is the number of violence, the number that we could estimate of domestic violence based on national surveys. So today, for instance, there are different studies and different household surveys that are conducted at national level that use this data precisely to estimate the prevalence of violence against women and domestic violence in a given context. In the case of São Paulo and in the case of Bogota, we don't have any national surveys that could help us to estimate the real prevalence. There are some studies that provide some rates, but like it's not a precise thing because they are only like independent studies. So specifically in the case of these two cities, we don't have any national survey providing this kind of information. And finally, the last layer is what we call the dark figure, which is actually the real prevalence that it's unknown, and it's unknown precisely because of the underreporting. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did with the literature review and the mapping of the risk factors increasing women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence. So precisely this diagram that you're looking right now, it was the diagram that we built after the review of that 147 articles. So in this diagram, it's of course an ecological model. So it's pretty much based on the ecological model. And in this diagram, what you can see, it's precisely the different also layers where we organized, or the different categories in which we organize these different factors affecting women's capacity to report, and not only affecting their capacity to report, but also risk factors increasing women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence. So for instance, when we look at the structural level, we see that we not only have some structural factors related to institutional sources, but we also see that we have structural sexism, which is pretty much based on traditional gender roles and norms that are entrenched in society. And the second type of structural factor is precisely structural racism. And below the overall structural racism, we have different types of factors related to racism, such as frustrated masculinity syndrome, which is something related to the fact that Black men have way less opportunities than white men. And that's why also sometimes this is, of course, like a very debatable factor, but still portrayed on the literature as a risk factor. There is also the discrimination and accessing public services, and of course, the institutionalized racism. Then we have the socioeconomic inequalities, and then of course, poverty and low income level, and access to housing and habitational conditions. So when we look at these structural factors, when we say that these structural factors increase women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence, it's precisely because they're affecting the dynamics within the society that put them on a higher risk of becoming victims at some point. And of course, when we go one step lower, we see those related to the personal, relation, and community and institutional categories. So of course, I'm not going to list all of this. I guess you all also had the opportunity to read them on the report. But basically, this was the exercise that we did to use. So we used this diagram, and we used this model that you're seeing on your screen right now, precisely to map the risk factors that were included in the data model to understand precisely the impact of these risk factors on a woman's capacity to report domestic violence. Here, just to give you a little bit of context also, we created a diagram, and you saw there are several different types of risk factors affecting women's capacity and vulnerability. But when we came to the exercise of actually finding databases and actually finding data that could provide information on these risk factors, what we saw when we came to that point is that data on risk factors are very scarce. So it was very difficult for us to actually find databases that could provide information on risk factors. And for instance, providing here on a comparison of the risk factors that we could map in terms of data for both cities and for both contexts, it narrowed down only for personal factors and the community factors, precisely those related to COVID-19, which are changes in mobility. And in terms of personal risk factors, age, marital status, education level, and number of children alive. These, from that really big diagram, these were the only risk factors that we could, that we mapped for the two cities. Of course, there were some more for São Paulo and some more for Bogota. But when you put them together and analyze what were the risk factors that we could see in both of the cities, these were the only ones. As you can see, only 5. So just to also illustrate how data, there is a huge gap and lack on data available to provide information on risk factors. And now I'm going to explain also briefly the different databases that we use precisely to build the model. So in the case of Bogota, there were 3 main sources that shared information on violence against women with us. The first one was the Secretariat of Women of Bogota. And from the Secretariat, so most of the data for the case of Bogota actually came from the Secretariat of Women. And they provided the largest set of data for us. And were precisely 2 different types of services in which they collected data on violence against women. One were the calls for the local helpline called Linha Púrpura. And the second one was the second type of service, which is kind of like a combination of 3 different services, are those provided to women victims that actually go in person searching for this type of services, which is called House of All, House of Equality and Opportunities, and Psychosocial Attention Duos. These services precisely are more focused on assistance, psychological assistance, also legal assistance to victims that that suffer some sort of violence and want to seek for some sort of help, that not only reporting the case of violence. Then we come to the second institution and source, which is the Presidential Advisor's Office for Women's Equity, which shared with us the calls to the national helpline, that it's the line 155. It's a bit different because we have the Linha Púrpura, which is only it's only placed in Bogota. So the calls for Linha Púrpura are only for Bogota. The calls to the national helpline are for the entire country. But when we conducted a filtering of this database, we kept only the calls that were made in Bogota. And finally, the last database is the crime statistics from the National Police. And this database is quite important because it's actually the policy reports that were made in person. So when the victims go for policy stations to actually report in person a case of domestic violence. And specifically here, the types of violences that we were able to assess were sexual crimes and intrafamilial violence. Then for the case of São Paulo, we also had 3 main sources of data. The first one, which was also the source that provided the biggest amount of data for us, was the Secretariat of Public Security of the state of São Paulo. And from the Secretariat of Public Security, we had access to 2 different data sources. The policy reports, as in the same case for Bogota, the policy reports that are filled in person. And then the calls to the line 190, which is very similar to the Linha Púrpura, is the local helpline for São Paulo. Then after that, we had access to legal data that came from the Superior Court of Justice of the state of São Paulo. The data they shared with us are data related to protection measures. So it's what we call the orders to keep the victims protected from their perpetrators. So that orders that through the legal system establish some sort of like minimum distance that perpetrators need to keep from the victims, and other types of like legal implications in case these perpetrators try to reach the victims after they have sealed a report of violence. And finally, the last source is actually, it actually came from a collaboration between different civil society organizations, which they call the Project Justiceiras. This project actually was created in the context of the pandemic, specifically to give more, to give another option, or to expand even a service of calls and WhatsApp messages in which the victims could use this service to report domestic violence in case they didn't want to search for the legal or official channels to report a case of domestic violence. And so this actually database was quite important because it provided us a different type of information that came not from official channels. However, because this database was created only in the context of the pandemic, we had very little amounts of data coming from it. And finally, in terms of non-traditional data sources, as I already mentioned before, we used the Google mobility reports, specifically the COVID-19 mobility reports that Google produced and created in the context of the pandemic. And we also use the Facebook Data for Good, of course, now called Meta Data for Good, which is also databases that provide information on different types of socioeconomic factors related to like this specific context of the cities. And now I'm going to explain a little bit about the results. So the first part is precisely about the reported prevalence. So here, what we are looking at is for the case of São Paulo. And the prevalence reported through the different databases in the case of São Paulo portrays a rather complex situation. So for instance, when we look at the orange line, which is the calls for the 190 service, hotline service, this set of data presents like the most salient trend for the case of the city, because it presents actually an 18% increase in the number of calls received from the military police between from 2019 to 2020. On the other hand, when we look at the reports on rape, also personal injury and threat, also the rape of vulnerable person, which comes from the Secretariat of Public Security, these type of like these specific cases, so rape, personal injury, and rape of a person, vulnerable person, they are the type of data that I just mentioned that could only be. It's the type of data that was collected from reports made in person at the policy station. And when we look at this, what we see is the opposite trend. So at least in the short term, with a stark decrease in the number of reports. So from like in statistics number, in concrete numbers, the reports made from March to July decreased by 27% between the years of 2019 and 2020. And of course, when we look at this type of information, what comes as a hint for us is that the COVID-19 indeed impacted the mobility because of the mobility restrictions. So it actually impacted the capacity of women to move or to leave their homes and actually go to the policy stations and report officially a case of domestic violence. But then when we look to Bogota, actually we see something a bit different from São Paulo, because in contrast with this complex situation presented for São Paulo, Bogota is a more straightforward trend. So when we see, for instance, the registers from the Línea Púrpura helpline, which is the local helpline, there was an increase from the beginning of the lockdown period, so March 2020, and this increase was maintained throughout the year. So just to let you know, so the Línea Púrpura is the green one. But also when we see like the comparison between the results between Línea Púrpura and Línea 155, they present a very similar behavior, which is this increase in the number of calls as of March 2020. But on the contrary, also on the other hand, when we look at the policy databases, as in the same case of São Paulo, we see a decrease as of March 2020. So the policy database is the darkest green. No, the light green is for Línea Púrpura. So again, very similar as in the case of São Paulo, what we can see in the case of Bogotá is that the impact brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically on mobility restrictions, is that women had way less opportunities to leave their place, specifically in the case of Bogotá, in which the lockdown was way more strict than in the case of São Paulo. So they could not go to seek for these services in person. And of course, the only way that they could report cases of domestic violence was through helplines, national and local helplines. And now I just want to briefly show you a heat map of the reports and registries, specifically at the week 13 in each of the cities, which corresponds to the beginning of the confinement period. So for instance, when we look for Bogotá, what we see is that the locality called La Candelaria, it's the locality that had the highest number of reports registered, registering domestic violence. This is a locality in the city center, so like it's located pretty much in the center of Bogotá, in the center of the city, which make us also to guess that because it's placed precisely on the city center, there are way more services available for women to not only report a case of domestic violence, but also to seek for help. So this is a very interesting also finding for the beginning of the pandemic. But in the case of São Paulo, it's a bit different because Santo Amaro, the neighborhood Santo Amaro, was the locality in Santo Amaro was the one with the highest number of reports registered at the week 13. But when we look the neighborhoods that are the localities that are actually neighboring Santo Amaro, so Campo Limpo, Vila Mariana, and Ipiranga, those are the ones with the least number of reported cases of domestic violence, which make us think that what are exactly the types of services that are available in Santo Amaro that are not available at these neighboring localities that make victims, that provided to victims more services to actually seek for help and report a case of domestic violence. And now the final part of the results is the analysis of the risk factors. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of a comparison of the different types of risk factors that we were able to map for each of the cities and that were like presented as the most relevant, impacting the probability of a woman to report domestic violence. So for instance, in the case of São Paulo, what we see here is that the number of individuals living in the same house, in the same place, actually impact the probability of a woman reporting. So for instance, when we looked at more than 3 people, when more than 3 people share the same room, that means they lived exactly in the same, not only like as a small place, as a small house, but they are actually sharing the same room to sleep, to do their like basic needs of our daily life. This actually impacts the probability of a woman reporting. So they show us, they increase the probability of a woman reporting. And also, of course, that makes a bit of sense for us, living close to essential and non-essential services. That means not isolated areas, that also increases the probability of a woman reporting a case of domestic violence. In the case of Bogota, there are two main community factors that increase a woman's probability of reporting a case of domestic violence. The first one is to not be a victim or involved in the process of disarmament given the armed conflict, and also to be not a victim of displacement. So that means that if you were not involved at all in the armed conflict, which actually came at the community level, one of the main risk factors portrayed in the literature affecting women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence. So that actually makes a lot of sense and actually confirms these results coming from the literature review. So if you're not a victim of the conflict, if you're not displaced from the conflict, and if you're not involved in the process of disarmament, that means that there's a higher probability of you as a woman reporting a case of domestic violence. Now, when we come to the personal factors and precisely breaking down the subcategory of age, we see also different trends between the two cities. For instance, in the case of São Paulo, what we see is that women between 30 and 49 years old, so usually actually adult women, older women, have the highest probability of reporting a case of domestic violence. But in the case of Bogota, this age population group is actually a bit younger. So it's between 20 and 40 years old. So the probability of a woman reporting a case of domestic violence in Bogota is higher when you're younger than in the case of São Paulo. Now, in the case of the marital status, we also see different trends between the two cities. So in the case of São Paulo, for instance, a probability of a woman reporting a domestic violence based on the marital status is higher when they are married or when they are in a stable union or in actual just a relationship. Whereas in the case of Bogota, it's the opposite trend. It's when this woman is not actually on a more concrete, let's say, relationship. That's when they are single, separated, or when they are widowed. So it's very interesting because both cities, although they share very similar features and characteristics, they also have very different results when it comes to these different risk factors or these different factors affecting the probability of a woman reporting domestic violence. And now we come also to the subcategory race. Here, actually, we also included these on the presentation because in the case of Bogota, it did not come as a statistically relevant factor affecting the probability of a woman reporting. And in the case of São Paulo, because actually racism is way more relevant and affects more the lives of women in Brazil than in Colombia, we decided to put this data here as well, precisely because when we look at the probability of actually reporting, we see that Black and white women share very similar rates, also in regards to suffering domestic violence. However, when we look at the violence that Black women suffer on the streets, so on public settings, there is like a 8.3% more of Black women being more risk of suffering violence at the streets than white women. So this is very interesting because also makes as researchers us to put ourselves to think why Black women are more vulnerable at the streets than white women. And of course, that when it comes to the other factors that we looked at that diagram, affecting their vulnerability to suffer domestic violence, and not only domestic violence, but overall gender-based violence, because races and institutional races and structural races affect a lot the lives of these women. And finally, the last part of the results, and I promise I will stop talking a little bit as I have talked a lot. So it comes to the mobility changes in São Paulo and Bogota by type of place and also and in comparison with the number of records. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Bogota and São Paulo had very different containment measures after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the case of São Paulo, there was no strict lockdown. In the case of Bogota, yes, there was a very strict lockdown. And this is very clear when we look at these trends coming from the data. Because, for instance, in the case of Brazil, which is these three first squares in the first line, what we see is there's not a big difference between mobility changes, because mobility was not that much impacted in São Paulo, and the number of reports. But when we look at the case of Bogota, in which there was a very strict lockdown, we see that there is way more number of reports in places where mobility was not that much affected. And in places where there was like strict mobility restrictions, we see that the number of reports and complaints on domestic violence are way lower. And now, after all of this information, I know it was quite a lot. I'm gonna hand over to Mateo to talk a little bit about the results.
Thank you, Anna. So yeah, like Anna said, we know this was a lot of information. So we just wanted to do a brief recap on like the main takeaways from each city, and then just like provide some general conclusions, right? So again, Brazil, the trends in Brazil for reported prevalence is that calls increased, obviously, between 2019 and 2020. Crime reports went down, right? And it was a stark decrease, like 20% of decrease in the reports. Something that also happened that we didn't mention in the previous slide is that emergency protective orders, these restraining orders that Anna mentioned at the beginning, also were showing an increase during 2019, but were later interrupted and decreased during 2020, right? So what does all of this say? There's a disrupting effect of the COVID-19 health crisis on violence against women, at least on the reporting of violence against women, right? So before the lockdown, women could go out, could head to police stations, could head to, whatever services they have in person and file a report, but now that wasn't possible, right? So they're locked away with their aggressor, meaning that they can't go in person and that the only resource they have at their disposal might be calls, right? There was also something I think it's worth mentioning, and it's that calls and crime reports before the pandemic had the same trend. I mean, they didn't vary much between each other. It was just like a 1% variation. So, I mean, that's where you can really see the effect of the COVID-19 health crisis, right? As you know, like the aggregated results by locality showed that the localities with the higher prevalence showed the greatest decrease, adjusting for population, obviously. And then the important factors in the city, the important risk factors that affect the probability and the capability of reporting were mostly individual, community, and COVID-19. It's important to point out also that there were no institutional factors that came out as statistically significant for Sao Paulo. So yeah, that's like the summary we want to leave you with, at least for Sao Paulo. And then Bogota, again, showed the same thing. Calls went up, crime reports went down. But then crime reports went down in Bogota for maybe another reason. A specific reason is that, obviously, again, given COVID, mobility was restricted. Women couldn't go out, but also the attention that was given in police stations was also lowered. A lot of the in-person services in the police stations in Bogota weren't active during that time. So even if women did have the opportunity to leave the house and go and make a report, they probably wouldn't have found some police stations persons to report to, right? So that's also important. Aggregated, like thinking of the aggregated results by the locality, the same thing happened in comparison to Sao Paulo. Biggest reported prevalence showed localities showed the biggest decrease. But then there were also some interesting insights from the case of Bogota. For example, all of the localities increased in calls, except a locality called La Candelaria. La Candelaria, before the pandemic, actually was the highest, was the locality with the highest reports, with the highest reported prevalence. But during the pandemic, that didn't change. So yeah, that was something also interesting to point out. Again, in Bogota, institutional factors weren't as important, and I'm going to go back on this a bit later. But yeah, individuals with like age, marital status, education. The most specific risk factor in Bogota was armed conflict, like Anna was mentioning. And I mean, I think that's very important to think about, because it means that if you didn't participate or were not direct victim of the armed conflict, of the internal armed conflict in Colombia, then you had more chances of reporting the violence. So there, I mean, there is the question of how does the armed conflict in Colombia relate to violence against women? And yeah, that's it. Again, like the mobility restrictions were obviously an important factor in Bogota as well. So what general conclusions can be drawn, like from the results of this report? First, that administrative data is good. It provides a good picture of what violence against women, like how you see violence against women in these cities, but there are obvious limitations, and there's still like a little bit of work to do to get closer to that dark figure that Anna was pointing out at the beginning. So, I mean, how should authorities do this? Like, overcome these limitations through three things, basically. First, incentivize and facilitate resources for these demographic groups that are at greater risk of violence against women, so they can actually report. This will lead to better data, right? Better insights and better solutions. But then how do you facilitate these resources, right? Well, governments should think about contextual factors and how public institutions can help reduce them or strengthen them, right? Because there are some factors that actually help women report violence against women. So yeah, public institutions should focus on those contextual factors, and at the end of the day, like, prevent stigmatization, right? Anna's going to talk about this a little bit later, but in trying to resolve this problem, trying to find solutions to these issues, you might also be stigmatizing some communities, right? And as we know, and as we've seen throughout the presentation, individual dimensions are not the only determinant of violence against women, right? There's also institutional factors, there's community factors, and that has to be taken into account, and there has to be measures taken so like you don't stigmatize populations when trying to solve this issue. So at the end of the day, I mean, all in all, what are we trying to say with all of this information we're sharing with you is that there's a gender data gap, right? There's a gender data gap that's not only focused in Sao Paulo and Bogota, not even to Colombia and Brazil, to, I mean, every country in general. And this gender data gap means not only that data is deficient, right? We're missing data, but it also means more subtle things. Like, for example, how is data being collected? How are socioeconomic issues being framed and tackled by public policies, right? How institutions are being set up. For example, and again, you'll see this a bit later, it was a great asset of ours that we had a direct connection with the Secretariat of Women in Bogota. So, I mean, why isn't this happening in Sao Paulo? Why isn't this happening in other cities? That's also part of the gender data gap. It's not just the data gap itself, it's everything that relates to the data collection process, the data project lifecycle. And yeah, so those are like the general conclusions. We actually had planned a little break here, Professor Karen, but I don't know if you want us to just continue or maybe have a shorter break, like a 5-minute break, or should we just go ahead?
Actually, I want to pause and see if there's any questions so far, and just give students a chance just to kind of think of what maybe came up for them and any questions that they may have. Okay, so we have one question, and I'll repeat the question in case.
I was just wondering how that COVID is kind of, or like once lockdown ends, do they think that the trend of less like in-person reports and more over the phone reports are going to continue, or is it going to change?
Okay, yeah, great question. Were you able to hear that?
No, I think
Yeah,
Yeah.
Actually, no. Can you repeat, Professor, please?
Okay, sure. So the question was, given, if when the lockdown ends, or, do you see a potential difference in the way that people are reporting? So for example, with calling versus going in person, how do you see that trend changing potentially? Is that accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can start, and then Mateo, please jump in at any moment you would like. So definitely there is a difference in trend of like mobility restrictions and confinement periods against no mobility restrictions and confinement periods. In the case of São Paulo, we say that the scenario and the situation is rather complex precisely because it's different to portray this confinement period when we did have the closure of non-essential services. So for instance, we had the closure of schools, we had the closure of food services, restaurants, bars, etc. But there was no strict lockdown. So people still were allowed to go on the streets, like there would not be some sort of like constraints or some sort of like legal restraints on people actually going on the streets. People stayed at home and then kind of like respected this sort of like confinement period because also of the fear of the virus and of being contaminated. But in the case of Bogota was different because in the case of Bogota, there was actually a strict lockdown period. But since the year 2020 was the first year of the pandemic, and this lockdown period was rather large in Bogota, it's different to identify precisely when this behavior on reporting actually started to change. So for instance, we see that difference when we compare 2019 with 2020, when our year without the pandemic and the year with the pandemic. But within the year of the pandemic, so let's say when actually the lockdown ended, we don't see that much of the difference. So it stays kind of like as a pattern, so like as a established trend throughout the year. Because people were, although there was no more mobility restrictions and the lockdown ended, people still were not 100% like feeling secured about going to the policy stations reporting. So that's more or less what we observed throughout the year 2020. So of course, we're only talking about the first year of the pandemic. To establish or to provide a rather different scenario from these, we would have to compare, for instance, the data from 2020 to 2021, in which actually mobility restrictions were decreased, and then people actually started leaving their places. And yes, for instance, I can say from information that I've read and had access to throughout 2021 and 2022 that reports on domestic violence increased again at the policy stations after the end of 2020. So when the first year of the pandemic ended. Don't know if you want to add anything related to that, Mateo.
Yeah, just one small thing, and maybe it's actually an example. So yeah, like Anna said, I mean, we don't have the data right now to say that. I mean, because obviously that was just for the first year of the pandemic. But I imagine like, yeah, things went back to normal. For example, the police reports, I imagine. But then there were other things, other behaviors that stayed. And I want to talk about an example in Bogota, where during the pandemic, there were the mayor's office habilitated a service in which women could go to gasoline stations or supermarkets, right? And use safe words to report violence against women, right? So they would go to the cashier to say like safe word, and then that cashier would register this report, and then just I don't know, send it to the police, and then they would go to this person's house. The pandemic, I mean, obviously hasn't ended. Lockdowns have, and this is still ongoing. So I think that although some things are going to go back to normal, meaning like before the onset of the pandemic, there are other services and other behaviors, both individually and both from the governmental institutions, that will change. For example, this service I just explained for Bogota. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right, any other questions?
When you're doing your research, how did you define violence against women or domestic violence? And how is that different from the way Bogota and Sao Paulo define violence against women? Like, were there any discrepancies in that definition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how did you define domestic violence? And, was your definition different than, I guess, the definition that you found while researching in these two contexts?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So that's also one of the biggest challenges in working with violence against women projects, research projects, right? Because different countries also have different definitions and then like typification laws to actually define what is violence against women and what is domestic violence. In our case, we based the definition of domestic violence on the information that we collected from theoretical literature review. The way that we actually framed these was based, then we built the way that we actually framed this for this project. Because we have, so like when we look at the diagram of Venn, I'm gonna just like quickly return there just to show you this. So we have these different definitions, right? And of course, there are overlaps between these different definitions. So here precisely. So when we think about gender-based violence, we see that gender-based violence is the most comprehensive definition in coming from the theory and coming from different theoretical frameworks, because gender-based violence is based on the gender. So that could be also violence against men or violence against children. That could be violence against the LGBT community. So that's the biggest one. And then within the definition of gender-based violence, we have these different like layers of what violence against women could be. And these definitions, as I explained also at some point, are based on the space in which the violence is committed, who is committing the violence, and of course, who is suffering the violence. So the definition of domestic violence, of course, came and was based from the literature, but the way that we define it, that for the specific context of the project, which is violence against women and girls in the domestic setting, was something that we came up for the interest that we had to understand how the COVID-19 specifically impacted the violence that was being perpetrated against women in the domestic space, in the domestic setting. Because a lot of different international organizations also came up with this situation in which there was like a surge in cases of domestic violence against women across the entire world. So in order to assess precisely how the pandemic was affecting women in São Paulo and Bogotá, we specifically focused on the domestic setting. The domestic setting, of course, defined it as the place of cohabitation between a family, between a couple, or between relationships, so a woman and a man in a stable union, for example. Don't know if that answers exactly the question.
I think, were you speaking more culturally, like cultural perception of what domestic violence
Yeah,
is?
I guess like this can be fine too. Like one is like from a data perspective, like would Colombia consider like XYZ as domestic violence, or is there like a higher standard for that? But yeah, there's also cultural complexity, like would women consider this a domestic violence in Colombia?
Right.
And like, is there different standards for that in different countries, and how would you accommodate that?
Yeah, I think the question is relates to cultural norms in terms of interpretation of what constitutes domestic violence, and then he's also asking about the idea of that kind of institutional and legal framework. And I think the question relates to is there a variation in any type of interpretation as researchers going in with a framework? Did you have to adjust, or did you see that there was any type of misalignment with the local perception of what domestic violence is?
Yes, no, we definitely had to adjust, because yes, there is not only I would say like locally, like in terms of like cultural norms and local interpretations of domestic violence, I would say for the case of São Paulo and Bogotá, or Brazil and Colombia, are quite similar, since the countries share very similar also cultural norms and regional also characteristics, right? So for instance, for both countries, what we see is that they are very based, or pretty much like traditional norms shaping every every different like aspects and every different layers of the society. So I would say, culturally speaking, both countries share very similar trends. And in this situation specifically, it was not that difficult to come up with a clear definition of what domestic violence means for the project. However, when we looked at the laws and precisely the typification of domestic violence and violence against women based on the laws, we know that there is definitely differences. And this is precisely one of the biggest challenges in working with violence against women, because not only in terms of countries, you also have like international standards and international definitions of what constitutes domestic violence, violence against women, gender-based violence. So for instance, today in Brazil, we have one of the most advanced laws typifying what constitutes violence against women and girls, because it defines very clear and it has very important explanations on not only the perpetrator, but how the violence is committed, where the violence is committed, etc. So for Brazil, this is very good. For Bogota, they also have good laws. But for instance, if we take a look at the other countries in Latin America, such as, let's say, Bolivia, for example, Bolivia doesn't have a very good or like any type of they do have a law like criminalizing violence against women, but it's very different from Brazil, in which the typification of the violence is way more clear than in the case of Bolivia. So, like summarizing everything. So specifically in the context for these two cities, it was not that difficult. But when we look at the bigger picture, yes, it is. And then of course, it's up to each of the researchers to understand how the definitions of these different types, not only of the space in which the violence is committed, but how the violence is committed and against is committed, should be clearly defined. So in this case, it was not that difficult, but of course, bringing up to the bigger pictures, it requires a lot of, like, I would say, detailed analysis and commitment to come up to a very good conclusion of it.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, any other questions? We have one question, yes.
In your like literature search and your journey in defining the problem statement, how did you standardize or weight a lot of the research that you had that was like traditional data sources and non-traditional data sources to try to come up with like a very cohesive and concrete background to base your study off of?
That's a hard question,
Yeah.
but it's a good question. So the question has to do with, how did you, during your, I guess, planning and your literature review process, how did you weight the sort of traditional and the non-traditional sources that would inform, I guess, your plan for the study? Yeah, is that accurate?
Yeah, it's like, I don't really know how to word it. So I think like, it was great.
So like how did we choose those data sets? Like focus on those data sets, or like that was going to be our approach?
Wait, 1 second. So after
You got like the background data that you had, how did you like weight like the impact that each of the like data sets that you had on violence against women in the country?
right.
Given that like the information that you get from each data set is very unique. Like the stuff that you get from like a WhatsApp call is very different than like a tweet. I think they said Twitter. And so how did you go about like, oh, like, WhatsApp calls are just as important as a tweet, or like there's more nuance here, like stuff like that.
Yeah. So what she's saying is that there's such a distinction in the types of sources. Like, how do you relegate importance, or how do you weight those in relation to kind of what you come up with in regards to the sources at the end, and how that then ties into the narrative. So she was saying like a WhatsApp call is different than a tweet, and so how did you kind of decipher and figure out the weighting of importance, I guess, as you assigned to the different databases that you were accessing?
Do you want me to go for this one, Mateo?
Yeah, go ahead and I'll add something.
Okay. So, I mean, the weight actually is based on the mathematical model, right? So like the way that the mathematical model was built was precisely to keep the weight of these different sources as the same. So we're not much relegating the importance to the source, but of course, when it comes to the interpretation, I mean, when I say source is the type of or the way that the victim is reporting the violence, right? But of course, then when it comes to an interpretation, it comes that's the moment in which requires the contextualization of how this reporting is made, right? So for instance, in terms of importance or the weight is the same as if I'm going to the police station to report or as if I'm making a WhatsApp call. But of course, then in the context of the pandemic, we know that a service providing the opportunity of like a panic button in which you are directly to a police to like as a direct line to report a case of domestic violence in comparison to a person that has actually to leave the house and make a report. Of course, that then has a difference, a very big difference. But mathematically speaking, in the model, there is no difference. I'm not sure if that's exactly the question, like if we are talking about like mathematically speaking, but I'm gonna let Mateo add as well and then see if we actually answered her question.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, all of the information is important and we didn't relegate anything at the onset. And that's also important to keep in mind because, again, there's a lot of underreporting going on. So any type of information we could get our hands on was good. I think the answer is more towards what Anna was saying. Then when like the team of data scientists at DPA actually included this in the model, then the model selected, if that's, I don't know, I don't think that's the correct term, but selected the databases that had more weight and that actually were providing useful information for a report versus the ones that did.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? So I guess I had a question, sort of in relation to that, I guess, when we think about different factors that impact these two contexts. And I was thinking about just the armed conflict reference in the data analysis. And then, it was making me kind of think about, armed conflict alongside this high level of insecurity in maybe the Sao Paulo or Brazil at large. And so I guess that's another question is how do you, if you're thinking of the post-traumatic stress from armed conflict engagement or a daily level of high insecurity in the context of Sao Paulo, or did those things not factor in? So that's my first question. And the second question had to do more with how when you look at the capabilities approach, do you link it to a rights-based approach in relation to human security? And was there a kind of a sense from these organizations that you were interviewing that there was action or steps to be taken in relation to accountability of trying to better the system of reporting or services or, kind of just looking forward? Did you link that capabilities approach to a rights-based approach? So those are my two questions.
I think I can answer the second one. And I just want to go back to maybe an example that Anna mentioned at the end. So, I mean, specifically, in the report, there isn't, I think, that explicit connection between a rights-based approach and the reporting capabilities. But I think we did find some insights that points towards that. And when we get to the recommendations, I think some of the recommendations, tend towards what you're saying, Professor. And it's so the example that Anna mentioned was that there was this locality where the prevalence was very high. I can't remember the name of Santa Mar. So that was the locality with the highest prevalence, right? And it was located in between two localities where there were the lowest reported prevalence. So that brings that puts forward the question of what's the difference between these localities that is like resulting in this, right? And I think it has to do with the rights approach you mentioned. Like, what are the public services? What are the resource distribution? What are the risk factors that are different in these localities that allow for women to report in higher numbers in Santo Amaro versus the other two. So yeah, there's definitely, I mean, there are some parts of the cities that are receiving certain services that others aren't, and that is a rights issue, obviously.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, sorry, Professor, could you repeat the first question so I just can properly answer it?
Yeah, so the first question was just in regards to this idea of armed conflict versus or alongside a high level of insecurity. And so, you know, thinking of, you know, kind of the longer post-traumatic stress experienced from armed conflict versus this kind of daily high level of insecurity that is experienced by the residents. So I guess I'm trying to understand, you know, how did you measure or how did you identify this high level of insecurity that maybe is related more to a kind of political or socioeconomic instability that is impacting the country versus this armed conflict that, you know, it's in a post-conflict phase. So there's still obviously experiences that are very impactful, you know, to those who were engaged or the after effects of that. So I guess I'm just trying to understand, like, is it apples and oranges, or did you kind of see something that can connect those two very different types of environments and experiences?
No, definitely they are connected, and therefore definitely when we, so that's the biggest issue about working with data, right? Because they are definitely connected. So when you see previous studies actually assessing the impact of like a political instability on also domestic violence, you see that they actually exist as a correlation between it. So not only in terms of that in countries with higher political instability, that is, it will exist necessarily more domestic violence. It's not about that, but it's precisely about what you're mentioning of how having, like, how living in an environment where there's this precisely this like environment embedded on this post-traumatic situation, how victims also feel, how this also affects the ability also of the victims in reporting. So the only issue about that is precisely that we don't have data to mathematically measure these incidents. Although we do have information coming, for instance, from key informant interviews and also from the literature review. So it was actually the first, for instance, the first moment in which we realized that the armed conflict and the political instability, the sense of insecurity caused by the armed conflict could be affecting the domestic violence and also women's capability to report domestic violence was during the literature review. Then during the semi-structured interviews, virtually all informants that we interviewed for this project mentioned the armed conflict and all these factors associated with the armed conflict as one of the biggest risk factors affecting women's vulnerability to suffer domestic violence and also their capacity to report, especially because it's not only in terms of the sense of insecurity and also in terms of the political instability, but it's also in terms of what the armed conflict has transformed, ideologically speaking as well, women's body and also men's perceptions of women's body. Because one important kind of like finding that came from the review of these studies is that during the armed conflict and even after the armed conflict, women's body were weaponized to be, and this is actually something, so I have done quite a bit of research on women, so gender-based violence in conflict affected settings. And when you take a look at this, this is quite like something that happens virtually in every single place that affected by the conflict and war. Women's body are transformed in this sort of like weapon of the war. How is that? It could be for as a ethnic cleansing as well. So there's just like morals and traditional norms that see women such as a body that should be respected and an instance that should be respected. So when they are violated and when they are physically abused, you are directly affecting the men that are related to that women. So if there are like some rival tribes or rival groups. So this also happened in the case of Bogota. So women's body became weaponized, and they were used to also affect as like a tactic to affect rebel groups, so different rebel groups competing during the armed conflict. And that's why also I think it's not only in the sense of like, as I said, in the sense of like political instability and also sense of insecurity, but how even the view of what a woman represents in a context like this has changed during the conflict. And of course, this affects, but the only issue with that, and specifically in the case of this project, because we don't have precisely data to assess the extent of this. We had access to the data, for instance, if you were part of the conflict, if you were a victim during the conflict, or if you participated of the disarmament process. This was the only type of data we had access to in terms of like conflicts related to the conflict. And then we saw, as we presented to you, and then as we saw, these were the main community factors impacting a women's probability of reporting.
Good, excellent, thank you. Great, any other questions? Okay, so we'll hand it back to you I know you're going to talk about hurdles and closing remarks and findings. Anything?
Yep. So yeah, we're going to talk about like the main data related obstacles, and then we could and I think we could just jump to the second part, right? We could skip the ethical. I mean, we could always share the presentation later. So I think this is a good thing to share with you. It's like the behind the scenes and the lessons learned with regards to data, and actually it may answer some of the questions you were asking right now. So for example, we divided like the main data obstacles into four things, right? So accessing data coverage and data disaggregation, the quality of the data, and data governance. Under access to data, we have like three main problems. We encountered three main problems. So the first one is the lack of open data sources, right? The second one is the long waiting periods to request the data, even under access to information laws. And then we also, like Anna had mentioned before, wanted to access original survey data we could. So Anna, if you could go ahead and I'll touch upon these points in a bit more detail. So the first thing is like the waiting periods. Here you can see like the different data sets for Colombia and for Brazil. For Bogota, the waiting periods were really, really short, like 1 week. But then for Brazil, it took us up until a month or even more to access this data. And it doesn't even take into account the time we took to actually finding who had the data, because that's another point that I will maybe hopefully come back to a little bit later, which is that a lot of institutions don't know who has the data, right? So institutions are very zealous of what they have. The second thing was, like I said, national surveys. Our primary source was local surveys from each city, but it would have been good to have national surveys that focus explicitly on violence against women to contrast this information. So for example, in Colombia, this exists. It's a national health survey from, I think, 2018, 2019. That is obviously outdated today, but when we started the project, it wasn't. And we tried to access that data, but the only thing that was available were reports or analysis from the data, not the data itself. We could never access the data itself. So yeah, that was the second thing. And then the final thing is that there are no open data sources in both countries, right? So although there are laws that state that public institutions should share this information publicly, each institution keeps it and it's only released under certain requests. So that was a big obstacle as well. So the next obstacle with regards to data was data coverage and data disaggregation, right? So the first thing was a lack of spatial and temporal granularity. And then the second one was a low number of socio-demographic indicators included in some of these databases. So for example, here you can see these are all the databases we use for Brazil and Colombia. The red row are actually databases we didn't use, but like time granularity varied a lot, right? Spatial granularity, not as much. But although absolutely necessary for security reasons, I imagine, we would have liked to have more time granularity, like all of them being daily. We had like mixed time granularity, which we had to work with, but I mean, it would have been better to have daily. Spatial granularity was good, like it was at the neighborhood level, under the locality level, but it would also have helped our analysis to have geo-referenced information. So they mentioned the neighborhood, but not they weren't geo-referenced. Again, this obviously responds to privacy measures, but I mean, this could have helped the analysis, especially the big data analysis, in a very impactful way. So yeah, the second problem with this was, yeah, go ahead, Anna, thanks. So the second problem we had with this was most of these databases have certain socio-demographic indicators, right? So for example, think of the calls to a helpline, right? So the service providers who collect this information obviously collect basic information such as sex, type of violence suffered according to their definitions, the relationship between the victim and the aggressor. But then there are a lot of things missing, and this is important if you want to do an intersectional analysis of this data, right? So for example, just to put an example, Bogota had a specific database which included gender identity, ethnic group, if the victim was living in a rural territory, if the woman was a head of a household, race, but not all of the databases included this information. So I mean, this is completely necessary to approach violence against women analysis with an intersectional perspective. If not, then we're just scratching the surface, right? And that's another like major obstacle we faced when requesting this data. Then the third data hurdle, as we call it, was data quality. And this actually answers, I think, one of the questions I was asked earlier. Data quality problems revolve around two things. So different conceptualizations of gender-based violence, right, by public institutions, and then the lack of data standardization, which can lead to data duplication and actually is a bit related to accessing data that's in unreadable formats. So for example, here, this is the case of Brazil. These are two databases we use, the police reports and the protective orders, right? And although there exists, and this is particularly in Brazil, although there exists like legal frameworks that define exactly what violence against women is. For example, in this case, the characterization of this domestic violence law in Brazil says that violence against women is every action or omission based on gender, which causes death, injuries, physical, sexual, or psychological suffering, and moral or material harm. Even though this exists, a lot of institutions don't base their definitions or their classifications of reports on this. So for example, database one uses this definition, but also uses other things, other things to classify the reports they receive from women. So crimes against the person, crimes against the patrimony, crimes against sexual dignity. And I mean, that's hard because there's a lot of different definitions. And then there are other types of databases like the protective orders ones, which don't necessarily base their definitions on legal conceptions, but just different descriptions. So we had descriptions of violence reported by women as, and this is verbatim, like threat resulting in the domestic violence, physical body injury, rape, bad treatment, and other descriptions, right? So this actually was a very important problem for us because we had our defined definition, right? And we actually had to go filter out each of the data points, almost each of the data points, to identify which fit under the violence against women in the domestic setting definition and which didn't. And I think that, I mean, differing definitions between databases is understandable to a point, because obviously it's not the same when you report a crime to the police or when you report a crime or a crime to one of the helplines. I mean, they probably have different institutional arrangements, different institutional frameworks that affect the definitions they use. But then there should be some kind, I mean, like baseline definition of what violence against women is. So the classification across all public institutions is more or less the same, right? Because this can also lead to re-victimization by public offices, right? Because if a woman were to report a violence that she suffered and it doesn't fit under any of these definitions, then that could be considered as something other than violence against women. So yeah, I mean, the conception of violence is the conceptualization of violence is very, very important. And the second issue with data quality was the lack of data standardization. As we've said before, there were different sources. Each of them had their own definitions. Each of them centralized their information in their own way. Each of them had a access process, a request process that's different from the other, right? And this lack of integrated system can lead to a duplication of data, which doesn't help us if we're trying to like really see what's the bigger picture, right? We want to really see what we call the shadow pandemic, which is violence against women and girls, right? There's an example of this in Bogota, where women in Bogota could call the Línea Púrpura, which was the local helpline, and then they could call the national helpline and register the same event, right? Report the same event, and they would be registered as different instances of violence. So what is needed in this case is our identifiers that can follow women through the diverse services they attend to, right? Because then we're not actually having the real prevalence or the real image of prevalence that we want. And then another thing, and this is just the last thing for data quality, was we sometimes receive data in unreadable formats. So for example, the survey data I mentioned from the National Health Survey we wanted to access was only in a report format, in a PDF format. And it was very difficult, obviously, to extract information from the report because we also wanted to explore the original data. So yeah, data quality was a big issue as well. And then finally, the last thing is data governance. That was the last data hurdle we faced. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning what data governance is. So data governance or data governance frameworks describe the data management related responsibilities and processes that ensure that data is available, that is of quality, that it's secure, that it's usable, right? All throughout the data project life cycle. So like the first thing with regards to data governance in that sense is that in Colombia, there are no established ethical or data privacy guidelines, both in Colombia and Brazil, while working with violence against women data. This means that this data that is very sensitive is not being approached in a way that is guaranteeing a victim's privacy and safety, right? And then an example of this is that civil society organizations that are working on the ground with the victims don't use any definitions or guidelines emitted by the government because they're practically non-existent. And when they do exist, I mean, they're not well thought out. So they use international best practices, as I think Anna mentioned before, and they don't base their definitions and their recording of these issues on governmental guidelines. The second problem is that there is little interoperability between institutions, first of all, between public institutions. So this leads to two things. First, nobody knows, I mean, nobody can really know who has what data, right? And then the other thing is that there actually are interinstitutional requests that take a lot of time. I mean, it's not only us from the outside that they take a long time to provide data for. It's in between the institutions that happens as well. And this leads to, I mean, this lack of interoperability leads to a lack of accountability, right? So, I mean, if everyone has data and no one has data, then there isn't really an institution that's carrying out the oversight of how this data is being used, how is it being centralized, how is it being shared, and yeah, I mean that means that these institutions really don't have explicit responsibilities over these data. And what else? Oh, there's also a lack of interoperability between the public institutions and the civil society organizations. So that means that there is an unfulfilled partnerships in the fight against violence against women. And I think those are like the main data hurdles I wanted to touch upon. And I don't know if you want to go ahead and talk about the second part. I know we're running a bit short on time.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mateo. So, of course, I would like to talk a little bit about not only in terms of like ethical dilemmas, but also ethical principles that we use to carry out this project, and specifically a project focused on violence against women and girls. But I think, as Mateo said, we are running a little bit of time. So, of course, we can make this the presentation available for you afterwards. So I think it's better if we just jump straight to the second part with precisely the quest for a robust gender data environment. And I'm going to start giving a little or like very fast introduction about why it is important to use an intersectional feminist approach when collecting data on violence against women and girls. So of course, there are like several different types of information related to why it is important to adopt or to use an intersectional feminist approach in collecting data on violence against women. But here specifically, I'm just going to point out three. The first one is precisely because oppression does not operate alone. So of course that we know that violence against women and girls is an endemic issue and affects mostly the gender women, right? So the woman gender. But by adopting an intersectional feminist approach, we know also that this gender or the vulnerability of this gender is not alone per se. There are several different other factors that increase or further exacerbate the vulnerability of like gender minorities, such as age, mental disabilities, religion, socioeconomic background, race, occupation, level of education, and even geographic location. So as I mentioned, in other words, by adopting an intersectional feminist approach, the data collectors can help to shed light on the various forms of inequality that often operate together and exacerbate each other. Because as I mentioned, for instance, at the beginning, in the case of Brazil, we know that Black women are way more vulnerable to suffer domestic violence at public settings than white women. So by not adopting an intersectional feminist approach, we don't pay attention to the way that these different kind of like oppressions are complementing each other and further exacerbating the vulnerability of like minorities and marginalized groups. The second reason why it is important is precisely to challenge unequal power structures and of course work towards justice. This second point is precisely based on principles that were put together by Catherine Ignazio and Klein. I'm not sure if you ever heard about this book that they wrote that is precisely called Data Feminism. And one of the points that they highlight about the importance of having intersectional feminist approaches on data collection, use, and analysis, it's because by using intersectional approaches, we can expose unequal power relations in data collection and in data science. And therefore, we need to commit to rising and rebalancing this distribution of power. And finally, the last one, which I think is one that is quite very much important, is to rethink binaries and hierarchies. So for instance, today, when we look at the gender data landscape, one of the things that we see the most is sex disaggregated data. So it's assumed from a structural perspective that gender is only two sex, woman and men, or female and male. And the idea of adopting an intersectional feminist approach is precisely to rethink this binary and consider that gender is a fluid concept. So it's a fluid thing. It's not something that could be placed only in the boxes of male and female. So having the view or working and creating, producing only sex disaggregated data, and therefore reinforcing the gender binary view, contributes also to reinforce the hierarchy in which men are on top, dominating social institutions from corporate boards to government leadership positions. So using intersectional feminist approach when working with data, and specifically data on violence against women, are very important because of these three points. Of course, there are other principles in this scenario, but I think these 3 points come up quite important because in the case of São Paulo and Bogotá, for instance, we never had access to the gender identity. Of course, as Mateo said, we did have in one of the databases of Bogotá, but like virtually for all the other databases, both in the case of Bogotá and São Paulo, we never had any variable that could identify. Therefore, the data collectors are not asking questions regarding gender identities. They are also not asking questions that could collect information, for instance, in how these power structures operate and how different socioeconomic characteristics and even other types of characteristics can further exacerbate the vulnerability of women to suffer domestic violence.
Thank you,
yes.
Joanna, so much. So we're hitting up on the time, but I just want to take this moment to say thank you to both of you. Just give everyone a round of applause. To Mateo and Anna for joining us today. It was a wonderful presentation, and you've given us so much to think about in relation to data shortcomings and how to mitigate harm and think about counter data points in looking at sensitive issues like this. So thank you again, and we will be in touch.
Well, no, thank you, and I hope you found the presentation interesting, and we'll also share it along, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.